You're nothing but an uneducated whore. Don't you dare speak to me until you learn how to read properly." The silence that followed those words didn't just fill the room, it swallowed it whole. Every fork froze midair. A sommelier 3 tables away stopped pouring a $900 bottle of Barolo. Everyone in Serafina, the most exclusive Italian restaurant on Manhattan's Upper East Side, was staring at the woman in the black Versace dress who'd just screamed at a waitress, but they were all looking at the wrong person, because they didn't know who that woman really was. She was Bianca Fontaine, the 28-year-old sister of Ezra Fontaine, the most powerful and most feared man on the entire East Coast, a man who owned half the real estate in Midtown and controlled the other half through means no newspaper dared to print. And insulting his sister in public was the kind of mistake that made people disappear, but the waitress, a 27-year-old woman named Ava Sinclair, didn't cry, didn't flinch, didn't apologize. Instead, she reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a Montblanc fountain pen that once belonged to her murdered father, and did something so devastating that it would cost the Mafia boss's sister her inheritance, her seat at the family table, and her freedom, all before the first course was even ordered. But here's the thing that'll keep you up tonight. The most dangerous part wasn't what Ava did to Bianca. It was the man sitting alone in the dark corner of that restaurant. A man with steel gray eyes and a silver family ring on his left hand. A man who hadn't said a single word the entire evening. Ezra Fontaine had been watching everything, and when a man like Ezra Fontaine notices you, only 2 things can happen. You vanish, or you become his. And what happened next? Well, to understand why the fall was so loud, you've got to understand just how invisible Ava Sinclair used to be. If this story already has your heart pounding, smash that like button right now. It really helps the channel more than you know. Share this with someone who's ever been underestimated. And if you haven't subscribed yet, hit subscribe and turn on that bell so you never miss a story like this. Now, let's go back to the beginning, back to the night Ava Sinclair was still just a ghost in a white apron, serving wine to people who never once looked her in the eye. Ava Sinclair was the kind of person you could sit beside on the subway every day for an entire year and never remember her face. That wasn't your fault. It was her survival skill. At 27, Ava was tired in the way sleep couldn't heal, the kind that settled into the bones, into the way she kept her head lowered when she walked, into the dark circles beneath her eyes that cheap concealer couldn't hide. By day, she was a doctoral candidate at New York University School of Law, specializing in transnational contract law and legal linguistics, the sort of specialty that made people nod politely at parties and then quietly drift away to find someone else to talk to. She spoke 4 languages fluently: English, Italian, Russian, and French. And she could read Latin too, that dead language she loved precisely because it never lied. At 22, she had won a Fulbright scholarship and spent a year in Florence studying ambiguous clauses in post-war treaties, the kind of clauses where a comma placed in the wrong spot could alter the borders of an entire nation. She had a 4.0 grade point average, a bachelor's degree from Georgetown on a full scholarship, and a mind that any law firm on Wall Street would have paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to possess. But that mind couldn't pay the rent in Queens, and it certainly couldn't cover the $6,000 a month for her mother's chemotherapy. Mary Sinclair, 58, once an elementary school teacher in Columbus, Ohio, the woman who had taught Ava her very first letters, was now lying in a hospital with stage 3 cancer. The marketplace insurance her mother had managed to buy came with an $8,000 annual deductible, and the best oncologists were out of network, so every month, Ava looked at the numbers on the bills and felt as though someone were slowly tightening a hand around her throat. So every evening, from 4 in the afternoon until 2 in the morning, 6 days a week, Ava put on her crisply pressed white shirt, tied her black apron, and turned into a ghost at Serafina. Her job was not to exist. Refill water when the glass was half empty. Sweep away the breadcrumbs before they touched the tablecloth. Smile when the guests smiled. Disappear when they didn't need her. She was good at it. Good in a way that was almost heartbreaking, because Ava Sinclair had learned how to be invisible long before she ever stepped into that restaurant. She had learned it on a winter night in 2015, when 2 police officers knocked on the door of their apartment in the Bronx and told her that her father, Patrick Sinclair, an immigration lawyer, a man who had spent his life helping undocumented families find a way to remain in America, had been shot to death in his office during a robbery. Ava was 16. She didn't cry in front of the officers. She waited until they had gone, and only then did she cry, And that was the first lesson she ever learned about invisibility, that if no one saw her hurting, then that pain couldn't be used against her. The only thing her father left her, aside from a pile of debt and an empty apartment, was a silver-capped Mont Blanc pen, the pen he had given her the day she received her Georgetown acceptance letter, the pen he had told her to keep, because language was the weapon of those who had nothing. Ava kept it in the pocket of her apron during every shift, right beside her order pad, as a reminder that she wasn't the apron she was wearing, that beneath that smooth white fabric was a woman who could read some of the most complex legal texts in human history. But on that stormy Tuesday night in November, when Ava stepped into her shift, and Franco, the Italian manager who always seemed to be sweating through his suit, stopped her at the kitchen door with a face as gray as if he'd just seen a ghost, she had no idea that the invisibility she had spent 11 years building was about to be shattered completely. And the ones who would shatter it wouldn't be her, but the Fontaine siblings sitting at table 4. Serafina sat on East 63rd Street, right between Park Avenue and Madison, hidden behind a modest limestone facade with no sign at all, only a black oak door and a doorman in a suit who knew every guest's name before they had the chance to open their mouth. Inside was a world of Carrara marble, candles set in brass holders, white linen tablecloths, and bottles of wine whose prices were never printed on the menu because if you had to ask the price, you didn't belong sitting there. The restaurant was known as one of the finest Italian dining addresses in Manhattan, a place where senators dined beside hedge fund managers, where deals worth millions of dollars were signed on napkins. But what none of the staff knew, not Ava, not Franco, was that Serafina didn't belong to any restaurant group at all. It belonged to the Fontaine family, registered under the name of a subsidiary of another subsidiary, buried beneath 7 layers of paperwork so deep it would take a federal audit team to trace it. The Fontaine family was one of the 3 most powerful families on the East Coast of America, alongside the Calloway family in New Jersey and the Marchetti family in Boston. On the surface, they were the owners of Fontaine Holdings, a real estate empire with more than 60 buildings in Manhattan, 3 boutique hotels, a chain of upscale restaurants, and a charitable foundation named after Ezra's mother, Helena Fontaine, which funded arts programs at the Met. Beneath the surface, they were a smooth-running money-laundering machine operating through a network of restaurants and hotels, a protection racket controlling much of the construction industry in Midtown, and a transatlantic weapons trafficking line that Europol had tracked but never once managed to touch. Standing at the head of all of it was Ezra Fontaine, 36 years old, the man Forbes called a real estate genius, the New York Post called the city's most desirable billionaire bachelor, and the people who truly knew him didn't call him anything at all, because saying Ezra Fontaine's name behind his back was the fastest way to make sure your own name appeared in the obituaries. Ezra was cold the way ice was cold, not because it tried to be, but because that was its nature. He never shouted, never made the same threat twice, never needed to. But Ezra also lived by a code he never broke, and in an underworld where the rules changed with the season, that made him more dangerous than any man who had none. He didn't touch innocent women, didn't traffic drugs, didn't kill children. 3 rules, never an exception, and anyone in the organization who broke them disappeared without trial. At that moment, Ezra was in the middle of the fiercest territorial war he had faced since taking over the family from his father 8 years earlier. His rival was Reed Calloway, 40 years old, head of the Calloway family, an organization that controlled much of the cargo shipping routes through the Port of Newark in New Jersey. The Port of Newark was the artery, with billions of dollars in goods moving through it every year, and whoever controlled the port controlled the East Coast. Ezra wanted that port. Reed would die before giving it up. The war was being fought in silence, through sabotaged construction bids, vanished shipments, and witnesses who suddenly lost their memory before stepping into court. And right in the middle of that war, Ezra discovered something that made his blood run cold. His sister, Bianca Fontaine, 28 years old, the woman he had protected all her life, the woman with a seat on the family council and access to every confidential piece of information, had secretly met with Reed Calloway. Twice. The first time at a charity gala in the Hamptons, the second time at a hotel bar in Tribeca at 11 o'clock at night. Maybe it was an accident, maybe it wasn't. Ezra didn't believe in coincidence, because in his world, coincidence was a luxury only the dead had once believed in. So tonight, Ezra had summoned Bianca to Serafina, not for dinner, but to inform her that she was being cut off from the family council. Her accounts were being frozen, and her inheritance rights were being suspended until the internal investigation was complete. That was why Bianca was sitting at table 4 that night, with her eyes swollen red and her fists clenched beneath the table. And that was why Franco stood at the kitchen door, with the face of a man about to attend a funeral, when he looked at Ava and said 2 words that made her stomach twist itself into a knot. "Table 4 is yours, Ava." Franco said it in a rushed whisper, shoving the leather-bound menu into her hands just outside the kitchen door. "Fontaine. Both siblings. Be careful." Last time, the sister threw a glass at the wall because the ice in her drink wasn't round enough. He didn't say anything more, and he didn't need to, because the name Fontaine in Manhattan's restaurant world was like the sound of a storm siren, the kind that made everyone who heard it lower their head and pray. Ava drew in a breath, smoothed her apron flat, and walked toward the farthest corner of the restaurant, where the candlelight was dimmest and the shadows were thickest, where table 4 sat apart from the rest like an island no one was allowed to swim toward. She saw him first. Ezra Fontaine sat back against a black velvet chair, one leg crossed over the other, dressed in a black 3-piece suit without a tie, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone to reveal his collarbone, and on the ring finger of his left hand was a silver ring engraved with a lion, the Fontaine family crest that Ava didn't recognize. He was reading from a leather-bound file opened on the table, turning the pages with long, unhurried fingers, and he didn't look up when Ava approached. Didn't look up when she laid down the napkin, didn't look up as if she didn't exist. And strangely, it was that complete indifference that made Ava understand this was the sort of man whose attention came at a price, and she absolutely didn't want to pay it. His eyes, in the brief instant when the candlelight caught the angle just right, were gray like steel, cold and still as the surface of a frozen lake. Across from Ezra sat Bianca. She wore a tight black Versace dress, lipstick as red as blood, black hair falling over her shoulders like a sheet of silk, and at a glance she looked like a fashion portrait torn from the pages of Vogue. But Ava noticed the details good waitresses always saw first. The swollen eyes beneath thick concealer, the pink around her nose as if she'd blown it in a hurry in the car, and the way her fingers gripped the napkin in her lap as though she were trying to keep herself from exploding. Bianca had cried before coming here, but she wasn't crying now. Now she was angry. "Good evening, sir and ma'am," Ava said in the even, gentle voice she had practiced thousands of times. "My name is Ava, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Would you like water or cocktails?" Ezra didn't look up. "Whiskey. Glenlivet, 25-year. Neat." Bianca didn't look at Ava. "Vodka. Straight. No ice." Ava wrote down the order and turned away. But after she had taken 3 steps toward the bar, Bianca's voice rose behind her, not addressed to Ava but to Ezra, yet loud enough for Ava to hear every word. "You don't have the right to do this," Bianca said through clenched teeth. "I have a seat on the council. Father left that seat to me." Ava slowed down, not because she wanted to listen, but because her legs suddenly forgot how to move quickly near table 4. Ezra's voice came in reply so low that Ava almost had to stop breathing to catch it, calm as if he were reading the weather. "Father also left you rules. Rule number 1. Never sit at the same table with the enemy." Bianca went still. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ezra turned a page in the file. "Hampton Gala, September. You sat at the VIP table beside Reed Calloway for 40 minutes. Tribeca Grand Hotel, October. You had a martini with him at the ground floor bar at 11 o'clock at night. Do you want me to continue? Or would you like to explain yourself?" "That was a coincidence," Bianca said quickly. Too quickly. "A charity gala, Ezra. The whole city was there. I didn't choose my seat. And Tribeca, I was at the bar with friends, and he happened to be there. You're being paranoid." Ezra closed the file with a soft snap. He looked up, and Ava, standing at the bar waiting for the drinks, happened to turn back at that exact moment and caught the instant Ezra Fontaine looked straight into his sister's eyes. And even though the distance from the bar to table 4 was nearly 10 meters, Ava still felt the temperature in the room drop. "You think I didn't know?" Ezra said, each word falling like a stone dropped into the bottom of a well. "Your accounts were frozen as of this morning. Your seat on the council has been suspended. Your system access has been revoked. Until the internal investigation is complete, you aren't a member of the family. You're a guest." Bianca's face changed through 3 stages in less than 3 seconds. White shock, then burning red. Then something darker and far more dangerous settling into her eyes. It was the face of someone who had just been stabbed in the back by the person closest to her in the middle of a restaurant, and instead of bleeding, she chose to look for someone to stab in return. Ava walked back to table 4, carrying the tray of drinks. She set the whiskey in front of Ezra, set the vodka in front of Bianca, and at that exact moment, Bianca Fontaine's swollen red eyes swept over her from head to toe, slowly, from her flat black shoes to her loosely pinned hair, and Ava realized, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, that she had just stepped into someone's line of fire. Bianca yanked the leather-bound menu out of Ava's hand before she could even set it down on the table, flipping it open with the movements of someone looking for something to be angry at, rather than something to eat. Serafina's menu was written entirely in Italian, with the English descriptions printed in small, italic type underneath. And in the dim candlelight of the restaurant, it was nearly impossible to read unless you were willing to put on glasses, and Bianca Fontaine would rather die than wear glasses in front of anyone. She narrowed her eyes at the first page, pulled the menu farther away, and then pushed it closer again, and Ava understood immediately that Bianca was struggling, but would sooner swallow a silver fork than admit it. "What is this?" Bianca said, stabbing her red lacquered finger at the first line in the antipasti section, her voice louder than necessary as though she were challenging the room rather than asking the waitress. "Ossobuco, ma'am," Ava answered in a calm, even voice. "It's slow braised veal shank with saffron vegetables, carrots, and celery in a white wine broth. It's one of the restaurant's signature dishes." Bianca didn't thank her. She pointed at the next line. "Then what about this? Risotto alla Milanese, ma'am. Arborio rice cooked with bone broth, butter, and saffron, in the traditional Milan style." Bianca turned the page and pointed at another line, faster this time, as though trying to find one sentence Ava couldn't answer. "And this one. Branzino al forno, whole roasted Mediterranean sea bass with lemon, garlic, and fresh oregano. The flesh is very tender, with no small bones. Very suitable if you like seafood." Ava said all of it without ever looking down at the menu. She knew every dish, every ingredient, every Italian pronunciation down to the last vowel, because she didn't just memorize the menu, she understood the language behind it, and that effortless fluency was exactly what Bianca couldn't bear. Every correct answer from Ava was another knife sliding into the pride Ezra had already torn open earlier that evening. Bianca had just been stripped of power by her brother, had her money frozen, had been treated like a traitor, and now a waitress was standing in front of her and knew more than she did about the very restaurant that carried her family name. Bianca snapped the menu shut with a hard slap. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" Bianca said, and her voice had changed now. It was no longer the voice of someone asking about the menu. It was the voice of someone choosing a target, standing there in that filthy apron, memorizing a few fancy Italian words and thinking that makes you better than me. You're just parroting lines like a trained bird. "Ma'am, I'm only answering your questions. If you'd like a little more time with the menu, I don't need time," Bianca cut in, her voice jumping an octave. "I need a restaurant that writes its menu in English instead of using these pretentious words to fool people." "Ezra." Bianca turned toward him, but Ezra didn't look up. He had already gone back to reading the file, as though his sister and the waitress were two cats yowling in an alley, and he was simply waiting for them to stop on their own. Bianca ground her teeth, Ezra's indifference pouring gasoline on the fire, and she turned back to Ava. Her eyes narrowed into two dark slits. She snapped the menu open to the last page, where a short paragraph in Italian was printed about allergy warnings and ingredients, and shoved it against Ava's chest. "Read it," Bianca said, her voice loud enough that the next table turned to look. "Read it out loud. The last line, the allergy warning section. Read it loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear if you're so clever." Ava looked down at the page, then looked back up at Bianca. She knew it was a trap. If she read it, she would be obeying a humiliating command in front of the whole room. If she didn't, Bianca would declare her illiterate. She chose silence. "Ma'am, I'd be happy to explain any ingredient if you have a question about allergies." Bianca smiled, and that smile was colder than anything Ezra had shown all night, because it was the smile of someone who had just found exactly what she needed. She stood up, nearly half a head taller than Ava in her heels, and turned toward the dining room, spreading both arms as though she were speaking before an audience. "She can't read," Bianca announced, her voice ringing across the room, cutting through the Puccini in the background and the sound of silverware against plates. "Illiterate. We're paying $800 a plate to be served by an uneducated whore who can't even read an allergy warning. We could die of anaphylactic shock, and this little girl still wouldn't know how to spell the words on a medicine bottle. The whole restaurant froze. At table 7, Senator Whitfield's wife lifted a hand to cover her mouth, eyes wide. At table 3, a publishing executive and his mistress stopped chewing mid-bite. 3 iPhones from 3 different tables were already raised, their little red lights blinking as they recorded. Franco came rushing out from the kitchen door, a white towel over his shoulder, his face the color of a corpse just pulled from the ground, his mouth already opening to say the 3 words Ava knew were coming, "You're fired." But Bianca wasn't done. She leaned in close, so close that Ava could smell Tom Ford perfume tangled with vodka on her breath, and said straight into her face in a slow hiss, each syllable sharpened like glass, "You're nothing but an uneducated whore. Don't open your mouth to speak to me again until you've learned how to read properly. Get out of my sight and send someone over here who at least finished elementary school." Ava stood perfectly still. 50 pairs of eyes pinned themselves to her like 50 needles, from every table, every corner, every narrow gap between shoulders wrapped in suits and evening gowns. She could feel every stare, the pitying look from table 7, the curious one from table 3, the darkly delighted look from an older couple by the window, the kind of people who paid for dinner partly for the food and partly because they enjoyed watching someone else get torn apart. Franco was hurrying toward her, his apron flapping, his mouth already rounded into the shape of the words Ava knew were coming. "Ava, you're fired. I'm sorry, but Miss Fontaine is Miss Fontaine." And Ava knew that in 3 seconds he would reach her, and everything would be over. She would lose the job, lose tonight's shift, lose the tips, lose the $600 this week that her mother needed for the anti-nausea medication after chemotherapy. But something happened inside Ava in that moment, and it wasn't the kind of shattering people like to write about in stories where the weak finally erupt. There was no explosion, no burst of fury. It was a click, small and cold and exact, like the sound of a switch being flipped in a dark room. And when that switch came on, Ava Sinclair, the waitress, the ghost in the white apron, the girl who had spent 11 years learning how to disappear, died, not slowly, instantly. And the woman who stepped forward in her place was Ava Sinclair, the doctoral candidate, the woman who had stood before a lecture hall of 300 people at NYU and argued about semantics in the treaties of Versailles without a tremor in her voice, the woman who had presented research before an academic panel in Florence in Italian so fluent that her Italian advisor had asked what part of Tuscany she had grown up in. Ava didn't step back, didn't look for Franco. Instead, her hand slipped into the pocket of her apron, and what she pulled out wasn't her order pad. It was the silver-capped Montblanc pen, black lacquer body gleaming, weighted perfectly in her palm, and when her fingers touched it, memory came crashing into her like a fist to the chest, her father standing in the doorway of their apartment in the Bronx on the day her Georgetown acceptance letter arrived, his hand shaking from joy and not from cold, placing the pen into her hand and saying, "Keep this, sweetheart." Language is the weapon of people who have nothing, and 4 months later, he was dead. Ava uncapped the pen. She gently took the menu from Bianca's hand, not snatching it, not wrestling for it, just sliding it free from those red lacquered fingers with the precision of a surgeon drawing out a scalpel. She laid the menu on the table, pulled a white linen napkin free, smoothed it flat beside Bianca's vodka glass, and began to write. Dark blue ink flowed across the white linen in sharp, even slanted handwriting, the handwriting of someone who had written thousands of pages of dissertation drafts by hand. And when Ava opened her mouth to speak, her voice had changed completely. Gone was the soft, deferential tone of the service industry. This voice was deeper, fuller, the voice of a woman who had once stood at a podium and made an entire hall go silent with her very first sentence. "Miss Fontaine," Ava said, and the whole room heard her, "You're concerned about my ability to read. That is an entirely reasonable concern where food safety is involved. So let's test it, shall we?" Bianca blinked and took half a step back, because that voice didn't belong to the waitress she had just torn apart. Ava kept writing on the linen napkin without looking down, her eyes fixed directly on Bianca's. "When I poured your drinks a moment ago," Ava said, "the leather file your brother was reading was lying open on the table, facing toward me. Garamond font, size 12. The document extended out about 3 inches. I have an eidetic memory, Miss Fontaine. It's more of a curse, really, but very useful when one studies ancient languages or legal contracts. Ava turned the linen napkin so Bianca could see what she had written. "You called me illiterate?" Ava said, her voice carrying all the way to the last table in the restaurant. "But I have just copied the opening section of the family asset transfer your brother is drafting. The one you clearly knew nothing about. The one stating that all of your shares in the restaurants, the real estate, and the trust assets are being transferred into a new fund to which you will have no access. And more importantly, that document contains a self-executing clause." Bianca didn't breathe. "If you create a public scandal within 6 months of the signing date," Ava said slowly, each word falling into the silent room like drops of acid, "you won't simply be frozen out temporarily. You lose your inheritance permanently. No appeal, no negotiation. Permanently." Ava stopped, looked at Bianca, looked at the 3 iPhones recording, looked at Senator Whitfield sitting open-mouthed at table 7. Then she spoke again. "You just triggered it, Miss Fontaine. Not because of me, because you didn't know how to stay quiet." The air inside Serafina was no longer merely tense. It had turned brittle, as if one dropped fork would make the whole room shatter like cheap crystal. And then Ezra Fontaine looked up, for the first time all evening. He truly looked, not the passing glance he gave waiters or servants or anyone else not worth taking up space in his mind, but looked in the way Ava imagined he looked at billion-dollar contracts before signing them, the kind of look that measured, weighed, and threatened all the way to the bone. His gray eyes fixed on Ava for 3 seconds of absolute silence. Then he turned to Bianca, and when he spoke, his voice was so calm it sounded like earth being poured onto the lid of a coffin. "She's right, Bianca. The self-executing clause, subsection 4, paragraph B. You just triggered it." Bianca looked at the linen napkin, then at the leather file on the table, then at her brother, and the color drained from her face so quickly that Ava could almost see it leaving, from pink to white to gray in less than 2 heartbeats. She collapsed back into the black velvet chair, her knees folding as if someone had pulled the bones from her legs, her mouth opening and closing, and opening again like the fish she would never order from the menu. "You can't," Bianca whispered, her voice breaking on the last word. "You can't do this to me. I'm your sister. I'm your blood." Ezra didn't answer. He placed the file into his leather briefcase, folded it shut, locked it, like a man closing a coffin, and preparing to leave a graveyard. And it was that silence, that refusal to acknowledge his sister's pain, that pushed Bianca over the final edge. She snatched up the glass of water on the table, the glass Ava had refilled with perfect precision, and not one drop clinging to the rim, and threw it straight into Ava's face. Cold water swept across her skin, ran down her collar, soaked into her apron, and dripped from her chin onto the marble floor. A sharp gasp rose from table 7, and Senator Whitfield's wife lurched to her feet, one hand over her mouth. Bianca leaned across the table, her face now twisted into something far beyond anger. It was pure fear dressed up as fury, and she hissed into Ava's face in a trembling voice full of venom. "I'll make you disappear. You don't know who I am. You don't know what I can do. Sit down, Bianca." Ezra didn't shout. He didn't need to. Those 2 words cut through the air like a blade through silk. Absolute, leaving no room for negotiation. This was the voice of a man who said sit down, and people sat down, not out of courtesy but out of survival instinct. Bianca froze, looked at her brother, looked at the whole room, looking at her, looked at the phone still recording. Then she snatched her Chanel clutch off the chair and stormed for the door, one hand over her face, her heels striking the stone floor like the countdown of a bomb that had already exploded. Franco broke out of his paralysis and rushed to table 4 with surprising speed for a middle-aged man in a tight suit, white towel over his shoulder, sweat beading on his forehead. He looked at Ava standing there with water dripping from her hair, then at Ezra, then back at Ava, and made the choice any restaurant manager would make when forced to choose between a waitress and a family that owned half of Manhattan. "Mr. Fontaine, I'm terribly sorry. Ava, get into the kitchen, right now. You're fired. Get out of here." Ava nodded. She turned to go, water still running from her apron down into her shoes, and she had taken 2 steps when Ezra's voice cut through the room. "Stop." Franco froze. Ava stopped walking. Ezra stood, buttoning his jacket with one hand in the kind of motion he had clearly practiced thousands of times, and looked straight at Franco, with those gray eyes that Ava could now swear made the air around them at least a few degrees colder than the rest of the room. "If you fire her," Ezra said in the gentle voice any intelligent man would recognize as the most dangerous one he possessed, "I will buy this building, terminate the lease, and turn it into a parking lot for my drivers. Do you understand? Franco turned the shade of white, usually seen only in corpses or freshly printed paper. Yes, Mr. Fontaine. Of course, she's our finest employee. Ezra reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. He wrote quickly, tore out the check, and placed it on the table beside the linen napkin Ava had written on. Dry cleaning, Ezra said, looking at Ava, and dinner theater. Then he walked away, didn't look back, didn't wait for thanks. He disappeared through the front door as though the room wasn't worthy of holding him 1 second longer. The silence lasted another beat. Then 2. Then, from table 7, Senator Whitfield's wife began to clap, slowly, deliberately, the kind of applause meant to make sure the entire room knew exactly where she stood. Then the publishing executive at table 3. Then the tourist couple in the corner. Within 10 seconds, the whole of Serafina was applauding the soaked waitress standing in the middle of the dining room with water dripping from her apron onto her cheap flat shoes. Ava didn't smile. She didn't feel victorious. She felt tired, the kind of tired she knew well, the kind sleep couldn't fix. She looked down at the check on the table, $15,000. She did the math in her head immediately because that was what she always did with numbers, translating them into how many months her mother might get to keep going. 2.5 months of chemotherapy, 2.5 months of anti-nausea medicine, 2.5 months in which her mother wouldn't have to look at a bill and cry. It was a lifeline. But when Ava picked up the check and tucked it into the pocket of her apron, right beside her father's Mont Blanc pen, she couldn't shake the feeling that the money had a smell, not the smell of ink or paper, but the smell of the world it came from. A world where people wrote checks the way other people wrote shopping lists. A world where $15,000 was a tip, and human beings were tools, and she had just stepped 1 foot into that world without realizing the other one was already about to be dragged in after it. The adrenaline crash came at 1 o'clock in the morning, in the employees' changing room behind the kitchen, a space no larger than a closet with 2 rusting metal lockers, a cracked mirror, and the smell of fried onion and garlic permanently soaked into the walls. Ava sat on a plastic chair, her hands trembling, not trembling from fear, but trembling because her body had finally caught up to what her mind had done an hour earlier, and it was protesting. She peeled off her soaked white shirt, wrung it out over the sink, watched the water drip down, and thought that she had just read backward from a confidential document belonging to the most powerful Mafia boss on the East Coast, and then announced its contents in front of 50 witnesses and 3 cameras, and she was still alive, which meant it was either a miracle or the worst part hadn't arrived yet. She was pulling an old t-shirt over her head when Franco appeared in the doorway of the changing room. He no longer looked angry. He looked frightened, the kind of frightened that belonged to a man who had just realized he was standing between 2 powers and didn't have enough legs to run toward either side. "There's a car in the alley," Franco said, his voice low as if he were sharing a state secret. "Black Bentley. The driver said he's waiting for you, Scholar. I don't know who Scholar is, but I'm guessing it's you." Franco looked at her with new eyes, the kind of look a man gives when he suddenly realizes the little fish he's been pushing around for 2 years is actually a shark. And he added one more sentence before disappearing. "Who are you, Ava?" Ava didn't answer. She pulled on her thin denim jacket, tucked the $15,000 check into her backpack beside the 400-page law book she read on the subway every night, and walked out through the back door. The alley behind Serafina was where the restaurant's elegance died a fast and merciless death. Blue dumpsters were piled high, the smell of rotten seafood and old grease mixing with the smell of urine from the corner where drunk men like to stop after midnight. And in the middle of that alley, gleaming and absurd like a swan in a pigsty, sat a black Bentley flying spur with the engine running, its red tail lights reflected in the standing water, the rear window lowered. Ezra Fontaine sat in the back seat, now wearing a tie, dark blue replacing the open collar from earlier, reading something on an iPad, the light from the screen cutting across his face in sharp planes of brightness and shadow like a Caravaggio painting. He didn't look up. "Get in the car, Ava." "I'm going home, Mr. Fontaine," Ava said, her hand tightening around the strap of her backpack. "I have class in the morning. New York University," Ezra said, still reading from the iPad, his voice as even as if he were reading off a grocery list. "Doctoral candidate, specializing in transnational contract law and legal linguistics, 4.0 grade point average, bachelor's degree from Georgetown, full scholarship, Fulbright scholarship in Florence, from 2021 to 2022. Fluent in 4 languages, reads Latin. He slid a finger across the iPad. Mary Sinclair, 58, stage 3 cancer. Undergoing chemotherapy in Columbus, Ohio. Marketplace insurance with an $8,000 annual deductible. Out-of-network oncology costs around $6,000 a month because the best doctor isn't in the cheaper insurance network. Patrick Sinclair, immigration attorney, shot to death in his office in the Bronx in 2015 in what police classified as a robbery. He looked up. Streetlight spilled into his gray eyes. "You're too good to be carrying plates, Ava." Ava felt the blood rise into her face, not from embarrassment, but from anger. The cold, sharp anger she had learned to control when she was 16. "You investigated me in 45 minutes. I have resources, and I don't like mysteries." "You're a mystery. Carrying plates pays the rent," Ava said, "and pays for chemotherapy." Ezra was silent for a beat. Then he opened the car door from the inside. "I'm in the middle of a real estate merger with Conti Group in Milan. $2 billion. My legal team, 15 people from Tristan Locke's firm, has reviewed the contract for 2 weeks. They say it's clean. They say it's ready to sign." He paused. "My instincts say they're wrong. But I can't read legal Italian." "You can." Ava looked at him. He looked back. There was no warmth in that gaze. No pity. No romantic admiration. Only the cold calculation of a man looking at a sharp tool and wanting to use it. And strangely, it was the most respectful thing anyone had offered Ava in years. "I'm not a corporate lawyer," Ava said. "I don't need a lawyer. I need someone who can read what 15 lawyers missed. Review the contract tonight. Consulting fee, $75,000. Cash, wire transfer, doesn't matter. $75,000. The number hung in the alley air between the smell of spoiled fish and the hum of the Bentley's engine. More than a year of chemotherapy for her mother. Nearly as much as her entire student debt. A number that could change everything. And Ava hated herself because she knew what she was going to say before her mouth even opened. She thought of her mother sitting in the chemotherapy chair with gray skin and shaking hands. She thought of the stack of bills with final notice stamped in red on the kitchen table. She thought of the Mont Blanc pen in her backpack, and her father's words that language was a weapon, and she stepped into the car. The interior smelled of leather and mint, so quiet that her ears rang after 10 hours of Serafina's kitchen noise. She sat down on the leather seat, set her backpack on her lap, and said, "I need coffee, black, and highlighters." Ezra Fontaine looked at her, and for the first time all evening, the first time Ava had seen it, he smiled. Not the cold smile he had used on Bianca, not the social smile he had used on senators and executives. This was real, small, almost reluctant, and it reached all the way to his eyes, taking half a degree of frost out of the gray. "Drive," he told the driver. Fontaine Holdings occupied the entire 50th floor of a glass tower in Midtown, the kind of building that at night looked like a silver sword driven straight into the Manhattan sky. The private elevator opened into a lobby paved in black marble, and Ava crossed it in her Waitress flats, the sharp little taps against the stone sounding like a reminder that she didn't belong in a place like this. She was still wearing her black Waitress trousers, but her wet shirt had been replaced with a gray cashmere sweater that Ezra's assistant had brought out from the spare wardrobe in his office, the kind of sweater that, the moment Ava touched it, she knew cost more than everything hanging in the closet of her Queens apartment put together. The conference room was a long chamber, with a mahogany table, large enough to seat 20 people, floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sleeping city below, and around the table sat 4 men who looked as if they had been poured from the same mold, charcoal suits without a wrinkle even though it was nearly 2 in the morning, perfectly knotted ties, cold faces. At the head of the table sat Tristan Locke, 52 years old, silver hair slicked straight back, skin tanned in the way of a man who spent his weekends in St. Bart's, and the eyes of an old fox who had survived 3 decades in the law by knowing exactly when to bite and when to lick. When Ezra walked in with Ava, Tristan looked up, and the expression on his face moved from serious to confused to irritated in the space of about 2 seconds. "Ezra," Tristan said, "we're finalizing the liability extension. Who is this?" He looked at Ava the way a man looks at a cleaning woman who has wandered into the wrong room. "My independent consultant," Ezra said, pulling out a chair for Ava and seating her at the head of the table directly across from Tristan, the most powerful seat in the room. "She's reviewing the Italian appendices." Tristan let out a small scoff. The kind, powerful men used when they believed they were witnessing the eccentricity of someone wealthier than themselves. Ezra, with all due respect, we have 3 native Italian speakers on my legal team. We've reviewed every document. What firm is she from? What firm she's from isn't your concern, Ezra said as he sat down. Hand her the file. Tristan hesitated, then pushed a thick stack of documents across the mahogany table toward Ava. He smiled at his 3 associates, the conspiratorial smile of men who thought they were all watching the same comedy. Ava ignored all of it. She took out her reading glasses, the kind with plastic frames that cost $4.99 at CVS, put them on, opened the first file, and began to read. The room fell silent, broken only by the ticking of the wall clock and the sound of Ava's highlighter whispering across the paper. Steady, precise, like the pulse of a machine. 10 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes. Tristan checked his watch. Ezra. Seriously. We have a signing at 9 in the morning. This is a waste of time. The girl is obviously just reading to look busy. Ava didn't look up. Responsabilità sussidiaria, she said aloud, pronouncing the Italian with perfect precision, every double vowel in its place. Tristan blinked. I'm sorry, what did you say? Ava looked up. Her eyes behind the cheap glasses were sharp as knives. Clause 14, paragraph 7. You translated responsabilità sussidiaria as subsidiary liability. Standard translation, Tristan said, his tone sharpening. It refers to the company's current debts. Standard in an ordinary business context. Yes, Ava said, turning a page. But this contract stipulates that all disputes will be arbitrated in Milan, Italy, under the Italian Civil Code as applied in the context of commercial real estate, specifically Article 412. Responsabilità sussidiaria carries a much broader scope than the English translation suggests. It includes inherited liability from previous owners, including unpaid tax debt, pending litigation, and in particular, she rotated the document and pointed to a tiny footnote at the bottom of the page in size 6 font. This footnote refers to a commercial building in Naples owned by Conti Group. That building is currently under Europol investigation for suspected money laundering. The room went still as paper. If you sign this contract, Mr. Fontaine, Ava said, turning toward Ezra, though her voice was loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, you won't simply be buying real estate. You'll be inheriting a Europol investigation. And once Europol has paperwork showing Fontaine Holdings as the new owner, the FBI will have legal grounds to open a cross-border investigation directly into every financial transaction your company has made over the past 10 years. She stopped and did the math quickly in the margin of the page. Estimated damage, $400 million in direct penalties, plus the risk of destroying the entire empire if the FBI finds anything unusual in your books, and in Mr. Fontaine's world. We both know they will. The tan color drained from Tristan Locke's face, as though someone had wiped it away with a wet cloth. He began pounding at his laptop in a frenzy, his associates flipping through the papers in a frantic rustle, and after a minute so long it felt suffocating, Tristan stopped typing, looked up, and his face had gone pale. There is precedent, he stammered. Bianchi v. Milan City Hall in 2019. But it's incredibly obscure. We didn't think it applied here. Ezra looked at Tristan. The expression on the Mafia boss's face was empty in a way that was terrifying. The kind of emptiness Ava imagined was the last thing many people saw before everything went black. You said it was clean. You said it was ready to sign. $400 million and the FBI at my door. And you didn't think it applied. Ezra stood up. Get out. Ezra, we can fix it. We can draft a supplemental clause. Tristan began. Get out, Ezra repeated. And this time, he didn't need to say it a third time. The 4 lawyers crammed their files into their briefcases, snapped their laptops shut, and within 30 seconds the conference room was empty, leaving only Ava and the Mafia boss, with all of New York City asleep beneath the 50th floor of glass. Ezra walked to the glass wall and stood there looking down at the city, his hands clasped behind his back, the lights of Manhattan reflected across the glass in thousands of tiny points that surrounded his dark silhouette like a reverse halo. He stayed silent for nearly a minute, and Ava said nothing, because she had read enough about body language to know this wasn't the silence of a man who was thinking. It was the silence of a man recalculating the entire chessboard. And when Ezra Fontaine recalculated the chessboard, it was best not to disturb him. You just saved me from the FBI, Ezra said at last. still with his back to her. "Do you know what that means?" "I know," Ava said. "And I also know I shouldn't know anything more than I already do." Ezra turned around. The small smile from earlier was gone, replaced by an expression Ava guessed was the closest version of respect he could offer anyone. He sat down across from her, placed both hands on the mahogany table, and the silver family crest ring flashed beneath the fluorescent light. "My chief of staff quit last week. More accurately, I fired him because he couldn't tell the difference between a contract and a piece of trash lining a garbage bin. The position is open. $300,000 a year, plus bonuses, plus full health insurance for you and your immediate family. No deductible, no network limits, no exceptions, including chemotherapy, surgery, medication, everything." Ava stopped breathing. No deductible, no network limits. Those 6 words spun through her head like 6 bullets loaded into a revolver, because those 6 words meant her mother wouldn't have to lie in a public hospital with overworked residents anymore. Those 6 words meant Mount Sinai, a private room, the best oncologist in the city, the kind of doctor ordinary people waited 6 months to see but someone with Fontaine Holdings insurance could see tomorrow morning. Those 6 words meant her mother could live, but Ava knew something else too. She knew that $300,000 a year wasn't a salary. It was the purchase price of silence. She knew that Ezra Fontaine's chief of staff wouldn't just schedule meetings and make coffee, but would read every contract, know every secret, touch every transaction, including the ones that if the FBI ever saw them would require a federal grand jury. She would be stepping into the underworld not through the back door but through the front, and once she was inside, she knew from the law books she read that getting out was never easy. "I have to finish my doctoral program," Ava said, her voice far calmer than what was happening inside her chest. She knew this wasn't the moment to look weak, not in front of this man, not while bargaining with the devil. "Finish it at night," Ezra said without the slightest hesitation, as though he had already expected that answer. "Finish it in my office if you want. I don't care what hour you write your dissertation. I care that you read every line of small print those 15 lawyers being paid millions of dollars failed to catch. I need someone who sees what all of them don't see. I need you." He held out his right hand, palm up, the silver ring glinting. Ava looked at that hand. This was the hand of a man who moved mountains, the hand that signed $15,000 checks the way other people signed receipts for coffee, the hand that had built an empire with both intelligence and violence, and now that hand was being offered to her, a waitress in black trousers and a borrowed cashmere sweater sitting in a conference room on the 50th floor at 2 a.m. She thought of the steady beeping of the monitor in her mother's chemotherapy room. She thought of the stack of bills stamped red on the kitchen table. She thought of her mother's eyes every time a nurse brought in another bill. Eyes that weren't afraid of dying but of becoming a burden to her daughter. And that fear hurt more than any tumor. "I have one condition," Ava said. Ezra didn't react. He only waited. "Never lie to me." Ava spoke slowly, looking straight into his gray eyes. "I'll read every line of small print for you. I'll find every trap. But if you lie to me even once, I'll walk out, and you'll never find a second person who can do what I do." Ezra looked at her. For a long time, the kind of look that made Ava feel it went straight through the borrowed cashmere sweater, through skin, through bone, all the way down to something she kept hidden in the deepest part of herself. Then he nodded. One single nod, decisive, without any elegant promise attached to it, because in his world, elegant promises were what weak men used, and he wasn't weak. Ava took his hand. Ezra's hand was dry and warm and gripped hers with exact pressure, not too strong as a show of power, not too light as a social gesture, but precisely enough that Ava understood this was a real pact, and both sides knew the price. But there was one thing Ava didn't know as she sat in that conference room on the 50th floor shaking hands with a Mafia boss at 2 a.m. She didn't know that while she was reading the Italian contract and uncovering the $400 million danger, Ezra had sent a message to his private intelligence team. The message had only one line: Patrick Sinclair, Bronx, 2015. Find out everything. And 3 days later, while Ava was signing her employment papers and choosing an insurance plan for her mother, Ezra received the first report. The robbery in 2015 hadn't been a robbery. Patrick Sinclair, immigration lawyer, had accidentally discovered that some of his clients were being referred through a channel connected to the Calloway family, and that channel wasn't only arranging immigration paperwork, it was also a cover for a human trafficking network. When Patrick began gathering evidence to expose it, Reed Calloway gave the order. 2 gunshots, an office in the Bronx, classified as a robbery. File closed. Ezra read that report at 3 a.m. in his dark office, the light from the iPad shining across his face, and he made a decision that would later come close to destroying everything between him and Ava. He decided to hide it from her, because Ezra knew that if Ava Sinclair ever found out Reed Calloway had killed her father, she wouldn't cry, she wouldn't collapse. She would go looking for him, and Reed Calloway would kill her without thinking twice. And Ezra Fontaine, for a reason he still wasn't ready to name, couldn't allow that to happen. 3 months later, Ava Sinclair no longer recognized herself in the mirror, and she wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or a bad one. The white apron was gone. In its place were custom-tailored suits, cut from Italian wool, navy, charcoal, ivory, fitted to her body like armor. And when she moved through the marble hallways of Fontaine Holdings, the staff stepped aside. Not out of fear, but because she moved with the speed and precision of someone who knew exactly where she was going and had no time to explain to anyone why. In 90 days, she had torn through every file in the company and uncovered 4 compromised contracts the legal team had missed. The first was a long-term lease agreement in Brooklyn, with an automatic renewal clause written in language so vague that the tenant could occupy the building for 40 years at an unchanged rate. The second was a hotel joint venture in Miami where the partner had buried an intellectual property transfer clause in a footnote printed in size 5 font. The third and fourth involved 2 protection deals in the construction industry, where the intermediary had skimmed 12% from each transaction and hidden it by splitting the theft into hundreds of fake consulting fees. Ava found all of it. In total, she had saved the company more than $200 million, fired 3 corrupt executives, and completely rewrote the contract review process. The board members, men who had scoffed when they heard Ezra had hired a waitress as his chief of staff, now stood when she entered the boardroom, not out of courtesy, but because they had seen what happened to the 3 executives who didn't. But the best part wasn't on the 50th floor. The best part was on the 12th floor of Mount Sinai Hospital, in a private room with windows overlooking Central Park, where Mary Sinclair sat up in bed with color back in her skin and light back in her eyes, and her smile back after disappearing for 2 years. The tumor was shrinking. The best oncologist at Mount Sinai, the one who used to require a 6-month wait just to get an appointment, now came to see her mother twice a week. Surgery was scheduled in 2 weeks, and for the first time, the doctor used the word optimistic when speaking about the prognosis. Ava called her mother every night after work, sitting in the dark office on the 50th floor with her high heels kicked off under the desk and her feet tucked up onto the chair, listening to her mother talk about the sweet nurse named Jolene and the chocolate pudding on the hospital menu that Mary insisted was the best she'd ever tasted, even though Ava knew she was only saying that so her daughter wouldn't worry. And when the call ended, Ava stretched out on the sofa in her office and slept. Slept well, slept deeply, for the first time in 5 years without nightmares about bills and monitor beeps and the smell of disinfectant. But something else was happening on the 50th floor too. Something Ava didn't name and Ezra didn't acknowledge. Something they both pretended wasn't there, even as it kept growing in the spaces between work and silence. It started with coffee. Every morning when Ava arrived at the office at 7, there was always a cup of black coffee on her desk, hot, unsweetened, exactly the way she drank it. And there was never a note beside it, but she knew where it came from, because no one else in the building knew. She drank her coffee black without sugar, except the one man she had said those words to in the Bentley at 1 a.m. Then there was the coat. One late evening when the entire building had gone dark, and only Ava's office was still lit, she found a black cashmere coat folded neatly over the back of her chair, still warm, and when she slipped it over her shoulders because the room was cold, the scent of cologne rose from the fabric, sandalwood and leather and something darker she had no business knowing by name, and she wore it for 2 hours, before folding it again and placing it outside Ezra's office door without knocking. Then came the moment they both knew had gone too far. On Tuesday morning before the board meeting, Ezra stopped at Ava's office door to collect a report, and Ava stood to hand him the file, saw that his tie was crooked, and without thinking reached up to fix it, tugging the knot gently back into place. And the instant her fingers touched his collar, both of them froze. There was less than a foot of space between them. Ava could smell coffee on his breath. Ezra looked down at her hand resting against his chest. No one breathed for 3 seconds. Then Ava pulled her hand back, stepped away, and said, "The report is on the desk, Mr. Fontaine." In a professional voice they both knew was only a thin coat of paint spread over whatever lay beneath, something neither of them was brave enough or reckless enough to name. Ezra nodded, picked up the file, and walked away. But he walked away more slowly than usual, and Ava watched him longer than she needed to, and both of them knew that whatever was happening between them wasn't romantic love. It was something far more dangerous. It was attraction between two people who should never have been near each other, between light and shadow, between the law and the underworld, and if either one of them crossed the line, there would be no way back. It began on a Tuesday morning, because in Ava's life, Tuesdays were always the days when everything fell apart. She was sitting in her office, reviewing the final draft of the press release for the Conti Group merger, the merger she had saved from disaster, and that was now being restructured with safer new terms, when Leo Tran, her 24-year-old assistant, a smart and loyal young man she had recruited from the NYU internship program, pushed the door open without knocking. Leo's face was paper white. "Turn on the TV," Leo said, his voice shaking. "Channel 4, right now." Ava picked up the remote and switched on the wall-mounted television. The image hit her like a slap. On the steps of the United States Federal Courthouse, in the Southern District of Manhattan, standing in the middle of a forest of microphones and cameras, was Bianca Fontaine. She was dressed in a high-necked black coat, a black veil covering half her face like a widow attending a funeral, even though her husband didn't exist and her brother was very much alive. Her eyes were red, her lips trembling, a tissue clutched in her hand, the entire performance choreographed so perfectly that Ava almost had to admire it if it hadn't been in the process of destroying her life. And standing right beside Bianca, his back straight, his silver hair brushed sleek, wearing the confident smile of a man holding a knife and knowing exactly where he was going to drive it, was Tristan Locke. "I'm the victim," Bianca sobbed into the microphones, her voice breaking at precisely the right moments as if she had practiced it in front of a mirror. "I was cast aside by my own brother because of a woman who manipulated him, a woman no one had ever heard of before that night, a woman who is a con artist." Tristan stepped forward, lifting a thick file in front of the cameras with the slick confidence of a man who had spent 30 years standing in courtrooms. "We have evidence," he said, his voice smooth as oil, "that Miss Ava Sinclair is not a scholar. She's a corporate spy. She deliberately falsified the translation of the Italian contract to panic Mr. Fontaine, get his loyal legal team fired, meaning me, and place herself in a position to gain access to every trade secret." He clicked a remote, and a slide appeared on the large screen behind him, showing a series of emails that looked as though they had been sent from Ava's company address to a recipient named Giovanni Russo at Callaway Industries. "As you can see," Tristan said, pointing to a highlighted line of text, "Miss Sinclair offered to provide confidential information about the merger in exchange for $3 million. The timestamp matches the very night she was hired. She deceived all of us." The television screen shifted to a split image that Ava knew would haunt her for weeks. On the left was her photograph from the Serafina employee file. Exhausted, hair disheveled, apron wrinkled. The eyes of someone who had worked a 10-hour shift and wanted nothing more than to go home and sleep. On the right was her photograph from the Fontaine Holdings website. Navy suit, hair smoothed back, sharp gaze, looking like an entirely different woman. The headline ran beneath it in huge red letters. "From apron to betrayal, the waitress who stole $1 billion empire." Ava stood there staring at the screen, and the room around her began to spin. The phone on her desk rang. Then the cell phone in her pocket rang. Then the desk phone rang again. Leo looked at her with wide, panicked eyes, his mouth open but unable to form words, and before she could tell him that everything would be all right, the office door opened and Frank was standing there, head of security, the man Ava had greeted every morning for 3 months, the man she bought donuts for on Fridays, because she knew he liked the Boston cream kind, and his face now looked carved from stone. "Miss Sinclair," Frank said, his eyes not looking at her but somewhere just above her shoulder. "I have orders to escort you out of the building. Your access has been revoked pending an internal investigation." "Did Ezra give that order?" Ava asked, and she hated her voice in that moment, hated the way it thinned at the end of the sentence as if someone had pulled all the air out of her lungs. Frank turned his face away. "I'm sorry, Ava. Please hand over your employee badge and company laptop." Ava looked around the office. The room that 3 months earlier had been nothing but 4 empty walls, and now held the legal bookshelves she had brought from home, her mother's photo on the desk, the cup of coffee from this morning still warm, the one she knew exactly who had placed there. She took off her badge, set the laptop on the desk, slipped her mother's photograph into the pocket of her coat, and walked out. She moved through the marble hallway that 3 months earlier she had crossed like a storm, but this time the hallway was silent, and the people she had once directed now watched her through half-open office doors with the look she recognized instantly because she had seen it all her life. The look of people staring at someone invisible. The elevator, alone, 50 floors down to the ground, and with each floor that passed, Ava felt another layer of armor falling away. The Navy suit, the title of Chief of Staff, the power, the respect, all of it peeling off in strips like old paint. And when the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, she knew what was waiting outside before she even saw it. Paparazzi. 20 cameras and flashes exploding like tiny firebombs without stopping. They swarmed her the moment she stepped through the revolving doors, shoving microphones into her face, shouting questions on top of one another, until it became a wall of noise no human being could cut through. Ava, how long have you been selling secrets to Calloway? Is it true you slept with Ezra Fontaine before Bianca lost her position? How much money did you take from Reed Calloway? Ava lowered her head, pressed her backpack against her chest, and tried to force her way through the crowd. She didn't cry. She had learned not to cry in front of strangers when she was 16. The filthy yellow taxi carried Ava back to Queens in silence. The driver glanced at her once through the rearview mirror and then stopped, because the face of the woman in the back seat was clearly the face of someone who didn't want to talk and shouldn't be asked if she was all right. The apartment in Queens was exactly as she had left it 3 months earlier. The old mattress sagging in the middle, the curtains faded pale, the kitchen faucet still dripping in its steady rhythm like a countdown clock ticking toward a place Ava didn't want to return to. She sat down on the edge of the bed, still wearing the navy suit, still in her heels, and stared up at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the peeling paint as if they were a map leading out of this mess. She called Mount Sinai Hospital. Nurse Jolene answered, cheerful as ever, saying her mother was fine, that she had just finished dinner and was watching a cooking show, that the tumor was still shrinking, that the doctor remained optimistic, that the surgery was still on schedule. Ava asked if she had watched the news. Jolene said no. She only watched the cooking channel. She hated the news. Ava closed her eyes and whispered thank you into the phone. She didn't dare go to the hospital. If her mother saw her like this, she would know, because Mary Sinclair might not be able to read legal Italian, but she could read her daughter's face more accurately than any document ever written, and Ava couldn't let her see her like this. Couldn't let her worry. Couldn't let that worry touch the surgery. Night fell over the Queen's apartment like a black blanket. Ava took off her shoes, lay down on the sagging mattress, and for the first time since her father's funeral 11 years earlier, she cried. Not because she had lost her job. Not because she had been framed. Not because of the paparazzi or the headlines or her face on television. She cried because Ezra Fontaine didn't call, didn't text, didn't ask a single question. He had simply cut her out of his life, with one order passed through the head of security. Clean, quick, efficient, as if tearing a page from a notebook and throwing it into the trash, as if the last 3 months had never existed, as if the black coffees waiting for her every morning had never existed, as if the moment she had straightened his tie and both of them had frozen had never existed. And it was that total erasure that hurt the most, because it confirmed the thing Ava had feared from the first day, that to Ezra Fontaine she had only ever been a tool, and when a tool was suspected of being broken, people threw it away without explanation. She cried until there were no tears left, and then she lay there in the dark, listening to the faucet drip and the city roar outside, and her hand slipped unconsciously into the pocket of her coat, touching the Mont Blanc pen she always carried. Always, like a talisman, like the thread that still tied her to the father who had died, and his voice sounded in her head, clear as it had been 11 years earlier. Keep this, sweetheart. Language is the weapon of people who have nothing. Ava opened her eyes, looked around the dark room. Streetlight filtered through the crack in the curtain and fell across the bookshelves lining the wall. Dozens of thick, heavy books she had carried with her from Georgetown to NYU to this apartment, books on comparative linguistics, on Roman syntax, on forensic document analysis, on the way a comma or a verb tense could reveal the true identity of the person who wrote it. And suddenly Tristan Locke's voice echoed in her mind, as clear as the replay of the news clip she had watched 3 times in the taxi home. We have emails. We have evidence. Emails. text, language. If they had emails, then they had writing. And if they had writing, then they had linguistic fingerprints. Because everyone who writes leaves habits, tics, errors, little signatures as individual as fingerprints and just as impossible to fake perfectly, especially when writing in a second language, especially when the forger doesn't truly command that language. Ava sat up, wiped her face with the sleeve of her $300 suit, turned on the light, walked to the desk where the battered old laptop she used for her dissertation still sat under 3 months of dust. She lifted the lid, powered it on, and the cold blue light of the screen washed over her face in the dark room. And in that light, her eyes were no longer red. They were sharp, cold, focused, the eyes of someone who had just found a target. "You want to play a language game with me?" Ava whispered into the empty room. "All right, Bianca, let's play." 3 days later, the conference room on the 50th floor of Fontaine Holdings was packed. This was the emergency shareholders meeting called by Tristan Locke, acting on behalf of a group of concerned investors together with Bianca Fontaine. And the air in the room hung heavy as the sky before a storm. Tristan stood at the front of the room, his silver hair still perfectly sleek, his smile still confident, controlling the presentation on the large screen with the ease of a man who had spent his whole life turning courtrooms into theaters. "As you can see," Tristan said, pointing to the chain of emails enlarged on the screen, "the evidence is undeniable. Miss Sinclair betrayed this company from the very first day. I move for a vote of no confidence against Mr. Ezra Fontaine for placing a spy in the highest seat of power, and for the immediate restoration of Miss Bianca Fontaine to the council." Bianca sat at the corner of the room wearing a pale gray suit, her hair neatly styled, her expression sorrowful in exactly the right measure, the perfect image of the wronged younger sister full of grace and forgiveness. "I only want what's best for the family," Bianca said softly, catching Ezra's eye and offering her brother a sad smile full of wounded tenderness. "You were deceived, Ezra. I forgive you." Ezra sat at the head of the table. He looked terrible. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. His eyes were sunken deep, his suit was wrinkled, and he hadn't spoken a single word since the meeting began. He just sat there like a gray-eyed stone statue slowly wearing away, and the shareholders around the table had begun murmuring that perhaps Ezra Fontaine had finally met an opponent he couldn't defeat. "I second the motion," a heavy-set man at the far end of the table said. "Tristan's golf partner. Vote now." And at that exact moment, the double doors of the conference room flew open. They didn't merely open, they burst wide. Security moved forward, then froze when they saw who was standing there. Ava Sinclair walked in. She wasn't wearing the navy suit. She wasn't wearing borrowed cashmere. She was dressed in her old Serafina waitress uniform, black trousers, white shirt, black apron, exactly as she had looked that first night. Her hair loosely pinned and slightly disheveled, and in her right hand was the silver-capped Mont Blanc pen, while her left arm held a thick stack of papers. "She has no right to be here," Tristan shouted, his face flushing red. "Security, remove her at once." "I am a shareholder," Ava said, and her voice carried across the entire room, clear, calm, the lecture hall voice she had used on that first night in the restaurant. 0.5% of Fontaine Holdings, clearly stated in my compensation package, which Mr. Locke should know because he drafted the original paperwork himself. I have the right to speak. Every eye turned toward Ezra. He looked at Ava, and for the first time in 3 days, something came back to life in those hollow gray eyes. Not a smile, not relief, but something Ava didn't have time to analyze now. Ezra signaled for security to stand down. Let her speak. Ava walked to the front of the room and stood beside the screen, displaying the emails used to accuse her, small in her waitress uniform beside the towering image. But she stood straight, and everyone in the room understood that size didn't matter when the person standing there was holding a grenade. "Mr. Locke says these emails prove I am a spy," Ava said. "He says I wrote them to a man named Giovanni Russo at Callaway Industries. He says they were written in Italian. So let's talk about Italian." She stepped toward the screen and used the Mont Blanc pen to circle a phrase in the email. "Here," Ava said. "The writer uses the congiuntivo in a formal register. Specifically, using the conditional avrei voluto instead of the required subjunctive avessi voluto within a hypothetical SE clause." She turned back to the room. "To anyone who isn't a linguist, this looks normal. But it isn't. This is a classic mistake made by people who learn Italian from textbooks. A native speaker would never use the condizionale in that part of a conditional sentence. It is the hallmark of an amateur, and anyone who has actually lived in Italy, as I did in Florence for 1 year, on a Fulbright scholarship, knows that writing like this in commercial correspondence is as strange as a modern American writing "thou shalt" in a text message. Tristan's face twitched. "You're grasping at straws," he said. "One grammar mistake proves nothing." "Ah, but it proves who wrote it," Ava said. She placed one document on the table. "This is a copy of Tristan Locke's college transcript from his study abroad program in Rome in 1996, obtained through subpoena. Mr. Locke failed Italian 201 twice. He only passed on the third attempt, and in his final essay, she flipped the page and pointed to a line highlighted in yellow. He made the exact same congiuntivo conjugation error, the same mistake, the same habit, the same linguistic fingerprint. Tristan opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Ava wasn't finished. She placed a second document on the table. "And here's the most interesting part. These are the Wi-Fi router logs from Serafina on the night of the incident. My friend Franco, the manager Miss Fontaine nearly cost his job, gave them to me. They show that a device named Bianca's iPhone uploaded a 600 megabyte file to a secure server owned by Locke Legal Partners at 8:47 that evening. At the exact moment I was pouring drinks at table 4, Ava turned and looked straight at Bianca. You didn't steal data from me, Miss Fontaine. You stole data from your brother's iPad through AirDrop while I was standing beside the table. You sent it to Tristan. And when the separation plot failed, the two of you used that data to forge emails and frame me." Bianca shot to her feet, the victim mask shattering, revealing underneath exactly what Ava had seen the first night. Pure arrogance and enormous fear crouched beneath it. "But the worst part isn't that you betrayed your brother," Ava said. And now her voice dropped lower, and the room went so quiet that the ticking wall clock could be heard. "It's that you sold the data to Reed Calloway." Ava paused, drew in one breath. "Reed Calloway, the man who ordered my father, Patrick Sinclair, killed 11 years ago in his office in the Bronx." The conference room froze. Ezra closed his eyes for 1 second, and Ava saw his jaw tighten so hard the muscle jumped beneath his skin. "I didn't steal the Fontaine family's secrets," Ava said, letting her gaze move across every face around the table. "I saved this family. Twice." "She's just a waitress," Bianca screamed, her voice shrill and desperate. "Exactly like that first night." "Yes," Ava said, and this time she allowed herself to smile. A small smile, tired but real. "I am the waitress, and my job is to serve people exactly what they deserve." 10 minutes later, the FBI arrived. It turned out that corporate espionage and evidence fabrication were federal crimes, and as Bianca was led away in handcuffs, shrieking that the dress she was wearing was limited edition and the agents were wrinkling it, she caught Ava's eye one last time, and in those eyes there was no arrogance left at all, only the naked fear of someone who had just realized the floor beneath her had always been a trapdoor. Tristan Locke was less dramatic. He cried as they led him away, stammering about plea deals, and for the first time, his sleek silver hair looked like the hair of an old man. When the conference room had emptied, and only the two of them remained, the projection screen still hummed with pale light, and the empty chairs around the mahogany table still held the warmth of the people who had just been sitting there. Ezra Fontaine stood up and walked toward Ava, looked at the waitress apron she was wearing, then lifted his eyes to her face, and for the first time, she saw something crack beneath the steel mask he had worn for 36 years. "I knew the truth from the second day," Ezra said, his voice rough like a man who hadn't slept for 3 nights straight. And looking at him then, Ava believed it. "I knew the emails were fake. I knew Bianca and Tristan were behind it. But if I protected you, if I stepped forward and said you were innocent, then the board would say you were my puppet. The media would say I was covering for a spy because of personal feelings. The FBI would suspect both of us. You had to prove yourself. Before the board, before the cameras, before the FBI, through your own ability, so no one could say you needed me in order to exist." Ava heard every word. She understood the logic behind it. She even admitted to herself that it was right. But logic didn't erase 3 nights lying alone on the sagging mattress in Queens, crying in the dark. "You left me alone," Ava said, and her voice didn't shake, but it was thin in the way it only became when someone was speaking a truth they wished they didn't have to say. 3 days. Not one call, not one message. I thought you believed them. Ezra looked at her, And what Ava saw on his face then wasn't polished regret, wasn't a rehearsed apology, but the real pain of a man who had made the right decision and paid for it with the very thing he hadn't known he possessed until he had nearly lost it. "Those 3 days," Ezra said, and his voice cracked slightly on the last word. Only a small fracture, but enough for Ava to hear an entire glacier collapsing somewhere inside him, were the longest 3 days of my life. Silence. Long. Heavy. Then Ava said the thing she knew would change everything between them, though she wasn't sure in which direction. "My father was killed by Reed Calloway. It wasn't a robbery. You knew that. And you hid it from me." Ezra didn't deny it, didn't justify it. He stood there and endured her gaze the way a man endures a bullet he knows he deserves. "Because if you knew," Ezra said slowly, "you would have gone looking for Reed Calloway, and he would have killed you without thinking twice. I couldn't let that happen." He stopped, and Ava saw his hand clench hard at his side, the silver family crest ring catching the fluorescent light. "I couldn't." Those 2 words weren't an explanation for a business decision. They were the closest Ezra Fontaine had ever come to saying aloud the thing both of them had felt over the past 3 months, but neither had named. And Ava heard it. She heard everything he wasn't saying behind those 2 words. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped back. "I resign, Ezra." He looked as though he had been punched. It was the first time Ava had ever seen Ezra Fontaine look truly surprised. He offered to double her salary, 5% equity, anything she wanted, but Ava shook her head. "It's not about the money. I realized during those 3 days in Queens that I don't want to become a shark. I don't want to spend my life fighting people like Bianca and Tristan. I want to teach. I want to finish my dissertation. I want to read dead languages because they're beautiful and honest, not contracts full of traps. But I want one thing." Ezra waited. "Reed Calloway pays for my father's death. Legally, not your way, not with a bullet, but my way. With evidence, with a courtroom, with language." Ezra looked at her as if he were seeing her truly for the first time. Not the waitress, not the chief of staff, but Ava Sinclair in full, a woman strong enough to refuse the power he was offering her. "You want me to help you bring Calloway to trial instead of putting a bullet in him?" "Yes. That's the harder way. That's the right way." 6 months later, Reed Calloway was convicted in federal court. The charges were money laundering, human trafficking, and orchestrating the murder of Patrick Sinclair. The key evidence wasn't the gun or a witness, but Ava Sinclair's forensic linguistic analysis, in which she proved that hundreds of immigration contracts used by the Calloway family were in fact linguistic cover for a trafficking network, and that the linguistic fingerprints in the documents matched Reed Calloway's orders directly. Her doctoral dissertation became evidence in court. Professor Ava Sinclair stood at the podium in a large lecture hall at New York University on a spring afternoon. The auditorium was packed, students sitting even on the steps and the floor. "Language," Ava said, her voice carrying through the hall, "is power. It is the weapon of the weak against the strong. It is the key that unlocks chains." She looked down at the front row. On the left sat Mary Sinclair, rosy-skinned, bright-eyed, smiling, healthy. Her surgery successful 6 months earlier, the tumor gone, and she was wearing the blue sweater Ava had bought her for her birthday, with her first month's salary as a professor. To her mother's right sat a man in a black suit, a silver ring on his ring finger, glancing at his watch as though he had somewhere more important to be. But he didn't leave, and he was listening to every word. Ezra Fontaine. Ava caught those gray eyes from the podium. She didn't smile. He didn't smile. He only gave the slightest nod, the nod shared between 2 people who knew each other down to the bone, 2 people who had walked through fire together and come out the other side with burns only the other could see. "Never let anyone tell you that your words don't matter," Ava said, closing the book on the podium. "And never, ever let anyone tell you that you can't read the fine print." The lecture hall erupted into applause. Ava Sinclair pulled out the silver-capped Montblanc pen, turned it once in her hand, smiled, and stepped down from the podium. She had served her final shift, not because she had to be invisible anymore, but because she had chosen to step into the light. Outside the lecture hall, the black Bentley was parked at the curb. Ezra Fontaine leaned against the car door, both hands clasped in front of him, the silver ring flashing beneath the afternoon sun. "There's a new problem," he said when Ava stepped outside. "This time it involves you. Directly." Ava looked at him, looked at the Bentley, looked at the blue Manhattan sky. Then she said, "I need coffee. Black." Ezra opened the car door. "I know." And that is the story of the waitress, the mafia boss's sister, called an uneducated whore. And what she did next left the entire restaurant in silence. It is a reminder that true intelligence doesn't live in the apron or the suit you wear, doesn't live in your bank balance or the family name you carry, but in what you know and how you use it. Bianca Fontaine thought she could crush Ava because Ava looked like a servant, but she forgot the golden rule of life, that the person serving your dinner hears everything, sees everything, and sometimes knows 100 times more than you do. Ava's story proves that when you underestimate the quiet person, very often you're the one who makes the loudest sound when you fall. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think of a time when someone looked down on you and you wished you had spoken back, then press the like button right now. It helps our channel more than you think. Share this video with someone you love, someone who feels small, someone who struggles every day without being seen, so they can know that their silence isn't weakness. It is strength waiting for the right moment. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, press subscribe and turn on the bell so you don't miss stories like this every day. I want to hear from you. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever been looked down on just because of your appearance? Have you ever had to swallow your tears and stay silent while deep inside you knew you were better than that? Write it in the comments. I read every line. I listen to every story. Because each of us carries an Ava Sinclair inside, waiting to step into the light. Thank you for staying until the final minute. I wish you and the people you love abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and happiness every day. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.